Hi, guys. We're going to be talking about the key events in life's history that have led us from no organisms to single celled organisms to multicellular organisms like today. This is all kept on the geological record, and it's divided into three different eras. The Archean era, where archaea organisms, which were basic single celled prokaryotes, really colonized the earth, and then the Proterozoic, and then the Phanerozoic eons. The Phanerozoic encompasses all of multicellular eukaryotic life. It's divided into three different eras as well: the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic, which we are currently in right now. This is basically everything slammed into one timetable. So here's our Archean, our single-celled organisms. We kind of got jellyfish a little bit in there, mostly algae or soft body invertebrates. And then we have our Paleozoic era here, where we really kind of got all the way up into like early tetrapods, lizards, things like that. Our Mesozoic, which includes the Jurassic, our dinosaur time frame. And then our Cenozoic, which we are currently in, that brought us all the way to the modern human. There are major boundaries in the geological divisions that correspond with the extinction events that wiped out a good amount of the population. For something to be consistent of an extinction event, it must wipe out at least 75% of Earth's species. This is kind of that clock feature again of showing everything on Earth happening within a 1 hour time frame. So here we have the origin of the solar system in the Earth at 4.6 billion years ago. That started our Archean, where early prokaryotes came out. Prokaryotes have not gone away. They have actually stayed single-celled organisms. Between 3 billion and 2 billion years ago, we got atmospheric oxygen from early forms of something called cyanobacteria, which we'll talk about in a few slides. Then our single-celled eukaryotes came out, our multicellular eukaryotes, then animals, colonization of land, and then all the way back up here in that last 1/100th of a second would be the human population and history. So let's look at prokaryotes. Our first single-celled organisms were found in the oldest known fossils in stromatolites. These are rocks formed by the accumulation of sedimentary rock in bacterial mats. They date back to about 3.5 billion years ago. Prokaryotes were Earth's sole inhabitants from about 3.5 to 2.1 billion years. Next comes atmospheric oxygen. Most of the atmospheric oxygen is from a biological origin, usually produced by oxidative photosynthesis, a reaction with dissolved iron, and precipitated out to form banded iron formations. What that basically means is as photosynthetic organisms were coming about, it reacted with dissolved iron and rock and actually turned those rocks that reddish brown color that we get when you get rust. This started kind of in the middle of that 3.5 to 2.3, but it's really thought at about 2.7 billion years ago, oxygen began accumulating in the atmosphere and then rusting that iron-rich rock, which gave us that reddish brown color that we see today. This is called the oxygen revolution that occurred between 2.7 and 2.3 billion years ago, and it caused the extinction of many prokaryotic groups that were not accustomed to breathing oxygen. Some groups survived and then adapted using cellular respiration to harvest their energy. So here is that oxidation or oxygen revolution that really kind of spiked up pretty high. The The early rise in oxygen was likely caused by an ancient form of cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria is a type of photosynthetic bacteria that floats on the surface of freshwater bodies. Now, in old Earth, 2.3 billion years ago, this type of cyanobacteria was really helpful because it was increasing the amount of oxygen in the air. However, cyanobacteria is actually something that plagues the state of New Hampshire every summer, and it reduces the amount of oxygen in the water, which is harmful for the plant and animal species that live inside of those freshwater ponds. A second, later increase in the rise of oxygen might have been caused by the evolution of eukaryotic cells containing chloroplast that then work together to form things like algae, sponges, coral, and then plants. Let's look at the single-celled eukaryotes. The first eukaryotic fossil dates back to about 1.2 or 2.1 billion years ago. Eukaryotic cells have a nuclear envelope, a mitochondrial, an endoplasmic reticulum, and a cytoskeleton. There's a theory that mitochondria and plastids, like chloroplast, were once their own individual prokaryotic cell, but they formed something called an endosymbiotic relationship. And this is now a theory, so it is scientific fact, that proposes that mitochondria and plastids, like chloroplasts, were originally their own cell that then lived inside of a host cell. Endosymbiosis is beneficial to both parties. The smaller cell, the mitochondria or the chloroplast, were able to get protection and food from the larger cell, and the larger cell gained energy from these smaller cells. How this actually gained entry into the host cell is not 100% known, but scientists think it was either undigested from prey. So one cell went to eat another cell and these organelles didn't digest properly, or that those two smaller cells were actually parasites and infected the host cell and realized that this was a beneficial relationship. The process of becoming more independent or interdependent, the host and the endosymbiont would have become a single organism over time. Mitochondria were thought to have actually been serial endosymbionts, meaning that they evolved before plastids through a sequence of endosymbiotic events to create the cell that was the mitochondria that was then injected or infected into a host cell to create a eukaryotic cell. So this is kind of just a picture of that happening. We have our protocell here, and that ancestral prokaryote. Here we can see the ingestion happening. That gives us a nuclear membrane, which defines our nucleus and our endoplasmic reticulum. Same thing happens with our mitochondria and eventually the plastids. There's a lot of evidence that supports the endosymbiotic origin of both mitochondria and plastids. First is that the inner membranes of both mitochondria and plastids are very similar to the plasma membrane found on prokaryotes. They both have the ability to divide in similar ways to earlier prokaryotes and are not controlled by the cell when they need to divide. These organelles have their own set of DNA, and their ribosomes are similar to the ribosomes found in ancient prokaryotic cells. This led to the origin of multicellularity. When single-celled eukaryotes were working together as a colony, they actually ended up kind of forming their own organism. And it kind of started with algae, really. The evolution of the eukaryotic cell allows for a greater range of the unicellular forms. A second wave of diversification occurred when multicellular cell organisms evolved and gave rise to things like algae and then plants and fungi, and finally animals. So multicellular eukaryotes. When looking at the DNA sequences of older eukaryotes and common eukaryotes, the date that is most common is about 1.5 billion years ago. The oldest known fossil of a multicellular eukaryote are of small algae that lived at 1.2 billion years ago. This algae was a colony of single-celled organisms that, in a sense, chose to work together for a common goal. The snowball Earth is a hypothesis that suggests that periods of extreme glycation, we call these our ice ages, confined life to the equator and the range just close to the equator, or deep sea vents, from 750 to 580 million years ago. We have found assemblages of larger and more diversified soft body organisms in this time range, more specifically to about 575 to 535 million years ago. Then we had animals arise. This started with the Cambrian explosion. This was an evolutionary explosion where we think a lot of these animals came from, and that refers to the sudden appearance of fossils that resemble modern animals that are still around today in animal phyla, or classes of animals, during the Cambrian period, which was 535 to 525 million years ago. There are a few types of animal phyla that occur earlier, like mollusks and sponges and your corals, because yes, coral is an animal in most cases. But it really started with sea-bearing animals and then exploded to your terrestrial animals. The Cambrian explosion provides the first evidence for any type of predator-prey relationship. So here we can see our sponges were kind of in that Proterozoic area. Same with other corals and starfish. Snakes, our mollusks are in there as well. And then the further into the Cambrian period, we got the more arthropods and then tetrapods we saw. DNA analysis suggests that many animal phyla have diverged before the Cambrian explosion, perhaps as early as 700,000 or 700 million to 1 billion years ago. Fossils in China provide evidence for this, showing modern animal phyla tens of millions of years before the Cambrian explosion truly happened, which is why the fossil record suggests that the Cambrian explosion had a long fuse, which essentially just means that it was a long time coming, that fuse burned for a long period of time before the explosion itself actually happened. And then we had the colonization of land. Fungi, plants, and animals began to colonize the land about 500 million years ago. Vascular tissue in plant transports material internally and appeared anywhere about 420 million years ago. And then the modern relationship between plants and fungi, like lichen on trees, suggests that mutually beneficial relationship was likely formed because plants and fungi colonized land together. Arthropods and tetrapods are the most widespread and diverse of the land mammals. Tetrapods have evolved from lobe-finned fishes around 365 million years ago. And yes, there is a lot of evidence that proves that early tetrapods, which is what humans are, evolved first from land or sea-bearing fishes.